Welcome to the YouTube channel of the Buddhist Audio Bookshelf, where we embark on a deep exploration of meditation by Thanissaro Bhikkhu, also known as Geoffrey DeGraff. Your continued support means the world to us, and we kindly ask you to like and share this audiobook to broaden its reach, bringing the wisdom it holds to even more people. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to receive immediate notifications when new content is uploaded. Together, we can foster a community dedicated to enlightenment and inner tranquility by spreading the teachings of meditation and mindfulness. We are sincerely grateful for your involvement in our mission to make these transformative teachings universally accessible. For your convenience, we've included a video playlist in the description below. Let's now begin today's reading. See yourself as active verbs. November 15, 2018. There was a famous scientist who wrote an autobiography entitled, "I Seem to Be an Active Verb." That sums up a lot of the ways in which the Buddha treats you. That you're active. The mind, he says, is not just sitting there receiving input from outside. Even before we see things, hear them, smell, taste, touch, or think about them, there's already a lot of activity going out from the mind. The Thai Ajahns call these the currents flowing out of the mind. Your intentions, your perceptions, your plans for things. All of these have an impact on how you're going to receive that outside contact. These activities prior to contact determine whether you're going to suffer from the contact or not. Even the suffering itself, the Buddha says, is an activity. He equates suffering with clinging. Clinging is the act of feeding on things. We're not only on the receiving end of suffering. We tend to think of ourselves as receiving suffering from outside, that we feel the pain that comes from something that's come to hit us. But then we hear the Buddha saying something else entirely. That it's because of the way we act that we suffer. Now, he's not saying that you shouldn't act at all. After all, there's the path, and the path, too, is a path of action. It'll take us to a place beyond action, but it first requires that we act. That's what we're trying to do right now. We're acting on the present moment. We're shaping it, and we're trying to learn how to shape it well to be part of that path. Bring the mind to the breath, keep thinking about the breath, evaluating the breath. How does it feel right now as you're breathing in? Question the breath. What's going on with it? And what are you doing? How are you relating to the breath? You're trying to bring the breath and the mind together. Both of these are activities. The way you breathe is an activity, as are the functions of the mind. The perceptions, the thoughts. How do you get these things to stay together so that breath and mind are acting in concert? That's the skill we're trying to develop right now, because when they act together we become more sensitive to them. It's as if the mind had lots of little minds, and they're all headed out in different directions. They don't know one another very well. But when we bring them all to the breath, we begin to see, oh, this is how minds work. They can watch one another. As you focus on the breath, you notice that a perception helps you stay there, an image you hold in mind. What kind of image do you have? Is it a useful one? One that's really useful, as the mind begins to settle down, is not so much that the breath is coming in from the outside, but that there's a breath energy that originates in the body at any of the resting spots that Ajahn Lee describes. Above the navel, the tip of the breastbone, the base of the throat, the palate of the mouth. Those are just a few. Notice when you breathe in. Where does the energy seem to emanate from? When you hold that perception in mind, your sensation of breathing will change. You'll find it easier to live with the idea that, as the mind begins to settle down, the breath gets very, very subtle, sometimes so subtle that it seems to stop. If you feel that you have to suck the air in from outside, the mind is going to panic, and that'll destroy the concentration. But if you remind yourself that the breath energy is something that originates from inside, and when the mind is really still, the brain uses very little oxygen, so the body will breathe only as much as it needs to, then it's easier to stay at ease without the in and out breath. The quieter the breath, the greater the sense of stillness inside. The breath is already there, filling the body, so you don't need to pull anything in from outside. That's a good perception to hold in mind. All of these are things we do. the perceiving, the breathing, the thinking. We're trying to bring them together here in a way that gives rise to a sense of well-being that's solid and also allows us to watch the mind and see in which ways we're creating our suffering. The Buddha equates suffering with clinging to the 5 aggregates. The aggregates are form, feeling, perception, mental fabrications, and consciousness, all of which the Buddha defines with verbs. Form, he says, deforms. In other words, in the form of your body there's nothing static. Feelings feel. Pleasure, pain, neither pleasure nor pain. Perceptions perceive. Thought fabrications fabricate, and consciousness conizes. These are all verbs, and we cling to them. The act of clinging is also a verb. We've got verbs holding on to verbs. What that means is that they're activities we like to do repeatedly. The problem is that all too often we get some measure of pleasure out of them, but we also create a lot of suffering and stress in the process, and we tend to turn a blind eye to the stress. The Buddha, here, is asking us to turn around and look at it directly. There's stress in the clinging, in this repeatedly having to hold on to particular activities, and he points out 4 ways in which we cling. 1 is clinging to sensuality. That's our fascination, not so much with sensual objects themselves, but with our sensual fantasies, plans, and resolves. I'd like to have this pleasure, I'd like to have that pleasure. Well, no, how about this one? We can design them as we like for ours, our pleasures, and in the realm of our imagination, we have pretty much free rein to do so. This is what the Buddha says we're attached to, much more than to the actual objects, which is one of the reasons we suffer so much. Say you get into a relationship with someone else. You have plans about how good it's going to be, but the actual person is very different from your plans. That's one of the ways in which we suffer. Then there's suffering over what the Buddha calls clinging to habits and practices. We have certain habits that we're pretty committed to, regardless of whether they really work or not. We're not going to change, and sometimes we even believe that sticking with certain habits, certain rituals, or certain ways of behaving will guarantee happiness. But all too often, those habits have little to do with happiness at all. It's just that we're familiar with them. They're like old shoes that are not very good for your foot, but, because you've worn them for so long, that's what you're used to. Then there's clinging to views, particularly views about how the world is this way or should be that way. This includes views about politics. You can get all fired up about those. People create a lot of suffering for themselves over these issues. And then the 4th kind of clinging is to views about yourself, the way you define yourself. You're this kind of person, you're that kind of person. You exist, you don't exist. You're finite. You're infinite. As the Buddha said, when you define yourself even as infinite, you limit yourself. I've known people who say that human beings are simply conditioned biological organisms. Or yesterday I read about someone saying that we're all algorithms. What can an algorithm know about the deathless? What can a biological organism, which is caused and conditioned, know about the unconditioned? Once you define yourself like that, you place huge limitations on yourself. So, these are some of the ways in which we cling and in which we suffer. The Buddha said that if you learn how not to do these things, though, you don't suffer. That's his basic solution. But his solution is strategic. After all, he recommends views, habits and practices, and even ways of fostering a sense of yourself that are all provisionally skillful parts of the path. The path does involve some clinging. It, too, is an activity. The only thing the Buddha doesn't recommend clinging to at all is sensuality. This fascination you have with what kind of sensual pleasures you want, he says, you put aside. Go with the other 3. You learn good habits and practices. Following the precepts, and learning the habit of practicing meditation, practicing concentration. You adopt right views about action, that you do have some freedom of choice here in the present moment. When describing the Buddha's awakening, the compilers of the canon talk about how he saw the universe on the night of his awakening, beings dying and being reborn from all different levels of the heavens, all the way down to the hells. But there are very few descriptions of the heavens and the hells in the canon, and the descriptions that are there are not complete. The Buddha didn't go into describing those things. What he did do, when he summarized his awakening, was to boil it down to a principle of causality. The principle that lies behind our actions. And one of the main features of that principle is that even though your past actions play some role in shaping the present moment, they don't play a total role. You do have some choices here and now, which is why we're able to follow the path to begin with. If everything were predetermined by past actions, you just have to roll along with their results, whatever they were, and you wouldn't be responsible for what was happening or what you're doing right now. The fact that you do have some role in shaping right now is what provides the opportunity for us to practice. So that's a view the Buddha has us develop. And also the view that it is possible through our actions to arrive at something where there is no action, where there is no conditioning, where there is no fabrication at all. That's a view the Buddha has you take on as a working hypothesis. As for your sense of self, he doesn't define what you are. Sometimes you hear it said that the Buddha defines you as the 5 aggregates, but he says, no, the aggregates aren't you. They're what you're doing. You're defining yourself in terms of those 5 aggregates, whichever activities you hold on to. Sometimes you identify yourself with your feelings, sometimes with the images you have in your mind, sometimes with your thinking, sometimes with your body, sometimes with your awareness or a combination of any of these. But that's not how the Buddha defines you. In fact, he doesn't define you at all. He doesn't have to. You're already defining yourself. Still, he does tell you to develop a sense of yourself as competent, that you can follow the path. He also recommends having a sense of love for yourself, in the sense that you don't want to act in any way that would cause you harm down the line. And if you really care about yourself, you're also not going to cause harm to any other people at all, because if you can harm them, then there's going to be trouble coming back. If your happiness depends on their misery, they're not going to stand for it. Even if they can't get you, your karma will, at least to some extent. Identify yourself with the thoughts in the mind that say, I want to find a happiness that's harmless, I want to find a happiness that's reliable, and have a sense that you can do this, that you can depend on yourself. You can develop the qualities. You have these potentials within you and you can develop them so that you can find that happiness. These are assumptions that the Buddha has you take on about yourself. So the path does involve some clinging, but it's provisional. When you've completed the path, then you can put it aside. Even your sense of who you are, you can put that aside at that point, too. In fact, everything gets put aside, everything gets dropped. In total awakening, there is no clinging at all. In fact, that's how awakening happens. It's from lack of clinging that people find release. But you have to cling to the path to get to that point. What this means is that you keep doing again and again the things that the Buddha recommends, the activities that he advises you to do. The habits and practices he teaches, the views about the world. Those are activities made out of thoughts and perceptions. Your sense of yourself is an activity too. You try to do these things in line with the Buddha's recommendations, and they'll take you to a spot where you can finally put them aside. The image in the canon is of a person taking a raft across a river. While on the river, you have to hold on to the raft so that the river doesn't wash you away, but once you get to the other side, you don't have to pick up the raft and carry it on your head. You just leave the raft there at the side of the river and you can go your way. Once you've solved this problem of the way you make suffering, you're free. There may be other issues you want to take up in life, but the big issue has been solved. And it is the big issue, because if you don't create suffering out of anything, there will be no suffering in your mind at all. Nothing from outside can come in and make you suffer. So, when the Buddha says we suffer in the clinging, it does throw some responsibility on us, but also gives us the freedom not to suffer. After all, if the suffering were coming from outside, then given that there are so many things outside that we can't control, the suffering would never end. But because it is an activity we do and it is an activity we don't have to do, that's why it is possible to have a path of practice that leads to suffering's end. Locate your craving. October 5, 2018. As we ordinarily go through life, when we come across sensory pleasures, we learn that they don't last, and so we try to milk as much as we can out of them before they go. But when you come to meditation, you have to adopt another attitude entirely. You're focused on your breath, not because you want the breath, but because you'd like the pleasure. You have to be frank with yourself about that, but at the same time, if you focus on the pleasure once it comes, you lose your foundation. Then you've lost them both, the breath and the pleasure. So, you have to remind yourself the pleasure will be there, and as you keep doing the work of staying with the breath consistently, the pleasure will stay and do its work. As the mind begins to settle down even more with the breath, you can start thinking of the breath spreading through the body, and that'll take the pleasure along with it. Think of the breath going down the spine, down the legs out to the toes, starting again at the back of the neck and going down the shoulders and the arms to the tips of the fingers, going through the torso, going through your head, eyes, ears, nose. As you gain a sense that the breath energy can flow in these places, the pleasure will go along with it. That'll be soothing to the body, but again, you stay with the breath. Let pleasure do its work on its own. This teaches you several important lessons. One is that you've got to focus on the causes, and the results will come as when you're focusing solely on the breath, you're thinking about the breath, and you're evaluating it. It's called directed thought and evaluation. As you try to stay there, all the way through the in-breath, all the way through the out, those three activities, singleness of preoccupation, directed thought, and evaluation, are the causes. As for the sense of pleasure and even rapture that can come, those are the results. You don't have to do those. You do the thinking, you do the evaluating, and then you make sure that you stay with this one object, which is the breath. That's all you have to do. The pleasure comes and it'll follow the breath. Part of the evaluation is this activity of thinking of the breath going to the different parts of the body, and of adjusting the breath as you need to, because as the mind settles down, the way you breathe is going to change, or the breathing that feels best for the body will change, so you want to be on top of that. You have to be alert, you have to be mindful to do what needs to be done, and let the pleasure take care of itself. Secondly, you're learning some important lessons about craving and about how to understand your mind. You'll notice this when the mind wanders off. An image will appear and you'll go into it. In fact, it happens so quickly, usually, that you don't even notice it. All of a sudden you find yourself someplace else. Well, a series of steps went into that. They start with a craving to do something that you particularly like, then a little world will appear around it, and then there will be a sense of yourself going into that world. As long as you're going along with it, you don't notice it. You don't really understand it. As the Buddha said, if you want to really understand anything in the mind, you have to be able to step back from it, you have to see it as something separate. So, working with the breath, even though you want the pleasure, is a good way of seeing the pleasure as separate. The pleasure is where your craving is aimed, but you're not going to focus there. You have to stick with the breath. Try to perfect this skill because it's going to come in really handy as you meditate further, as you try to get more and more insight into what your mind is doing. Try to get so that when the mind moves, you don't have to move with it. It veers off in a new direction, but you don't veer along with it. You stay right where you are. You'll see that if you don't follow it, that impulse to move will go for a little ways. In the forest tradition, they called it the current of the mind. It'll go for a little ways, but then because you're not following along with it, you're not pushing it along or riding it, it'll stop. It needs you to jump in for it to keep going, but if you don't go with it, it falls for a little ways, and then it's gone. This way, you begin to see the extent to which you are creating these things. In particular, you learn some interesting lessons about craving. As I said, we're here meditating because we crave the pleasure it can provide, but we can't go directly to the object of the craving. This is a good lesson in seeing the craving itself as something separate, and it helps you get a clearer idea of where your craving is located. There's an interesting passage in the canon where the Buddha says, "Those things that you've never seen or sensed, is there any craving there?" And part of you might say, well, yes, there are lots of things that I haven't seen that I would like to see. But that's not what the Buddha's asking. The craving isn't located there in the seeing. The craving is located in your thought about the seeing. You want to detect exactly where the craving is so that you can understand it, because that's where the allure for going into a particular mind state is going to be found. You know those 5 stages the Buddha advises for dealing with anything coming up in the mind that you know will lead you in the wrong direction. The first is to see its origination. In other words, when it arises, what sparks it? Say you have a desire to go someplace. What brought that desire on? Maybe a feeling in the body or a little image appearing in the mind. A random thought goes through the brain and sparks a new desire. You want to see that, because all too often the things that cause us to do some very unskillful things are pretty minor to begin with, so minor that we hardly even notice them. With a lot of addicts, there's just a strange feeling in the body, and their immediate reaction is, I need a hit of whatever the addiction is. Just a little feeling of dis-ease in the body, and they immediately run to whatever their addiction is. They can cause themselves a lot of trouble without realizing that it was just a little word here, a little feeling there, that sparked it. You want to learn how to see that. You also want to see it disappear. In other words, desires come but they don't last all that long. Our problem is that we dig them up again and keep them going. We push them again and again and again. We revive them because we want to get something out of them. But it's important to see that they're not as solid and monolithic as they sometimes seem to be. Seeing this gives you a handle on these things, because all too often a desire comes up, and part of the mind says, if I don't give into it, it's just going to get stronger and stronger and stronger, until I just can't stand it. What's actually happening is that it comes back, and each time it comes back, you breathe in a certain way around it. That way of breathing becomes habitual, gets associated with the desire, and feels uncomfortable. That's actually what you've got to get out of your system. That uncomfortable breathing. Well, you can do that with the breath, the lessons you learn in calming the breath, adjusting the breath. You don't need to give in to the desire. So, you want to see these things coming and going, and then you want to look for the allure. Why is it that you go for them? Why do you want to go into them? The allure is going to be where your craving is located. It's an interesting idea. The location of craving. In the Buddha's analysis, craving is based on feeling, but where is that feeling based? It can be based in an object, or it can be based in the way you talk to yourself about the object, or the perceptions you hold in mind, what the Buddha calls verbal fabrication and mental fabrication. Think about advertisements. Often they're not selling the object. They're selling a particular feeling around the object, or an appealing perception around the object. You probably saw that commercial for the BMW Chill a few years back. A guy comes up to the top of an auto park, and he sees his BMW parked among a lot of other jalopies, and a little chill goes through him. He's got the BMW. He's the owner of the BMW. Well, they're not selling the BMW. They're selling that perception, that feeling, the chill, hoping that you'll associate it with the BMW and spend all that money to buy a BMW for the sake of the chill. So you want to be very clear about exactly where the craving is, because that's where the allure is going to be found. This is especially clear in relationships. All too often, one person is attracted to another person, but doesn't actually like the other person. He or she is attracted to an idea about that person, a perception around the person, or a feeling around the person. Which is often why relationships don't go very well. You didn't want the other person, you wanted the perception. So, to avoid a lot of the problems in life, learn to see where your craving is located, so that you can see through the allure of your unskillful mind states. This is something that we tend to hide from ourselves, because all too often a lot of the allure is based on things that we really don't want to admit to ourselves. We're attracted to certain things we find embarrassing, so we hide them, not only from others, but also from ourselves. You need to see the allure precisely where it is so that you can compare it to the drawbacks, and again, be very honest with yourself about what the drawbacks are. These, too, we can hide from ourselves. If there's something we really like, we can justify almost anything. If it's harming somebody else, we say, well, that person doesn't matter, or it's not really harming them, or their suffering has nothing to do with my actions, and we get into huge denial. This is why the pleasure of concentration is so important. It gives you an alternative pleasure so that you can look at these other pleasures and be frank about exactly where you like them, and at the same time be very frank about what their drawbacks are. Because it's when you see that the drawbacks really outweigh the allure, that's when you can get to dispassion, the escape from that particular unskillful habit. So, this process of getting the mind to settle down with the breath as you're creating a sense of pleasure teaches you a lot of lessons about the different activities going on in the mind, the different functions. In particular, it teaches you exactly where your craving is located and how you don't have to follow along with it. You can see it go, but you don't follow it. That's how you can help get yourself free from these things. You begin to parse out the different activities of the mind, the directed thought, the evaluation, what the Buddha calls verbal fabrication, along with the perception that holds you with the breath. How do you perceive the breath going through the body? Notice that the way you change that perception will change the way you feel the breath in the body, but the perception and the breath are two different things. The directed thought and evaluation use the perception, but they're different things, too. As you parse these things out, you're in a better position to see where your secret cravings are, where the hidden allure is for the things you do that part of you doesn't like to do, but another part seems to really want to do. This helps you locate where that other part is. This is why the Buddha said that when you do jhana, or right concentration, you're developing not only tranquility, but also insight. The insight and the tranquility help get you into concentration, and the concentration helps sharpen both of these qualities of the mind. This is why we stay with the breath, not because we want to get the breath, but because it teaches us so many lessons about the mind, and those are the lessons we really want, that are really worth wanting. Choice is now and at death. September 9, 2019. All phenomena are rooted in desire. It's one of the basic principles in the Buddha's teachings, and it applies to your meditation right now. Make sure you desire the right things. Different desires will come up, some of them wanting to stay with the breath, some of them wanting to wander off. So, hold on to the desires that want to stay, because who knows where you'll wander off to otherwise. But if you stay with the breath, you can get the mind into a state of concentration. The concentration can give rise to discernment. Discernment will help you see through all the processes by which desire creates things, and you get to the point where you can go beyond. Whereas if you wander off, you'll end up just coming back to the same old desires that you've been mucking around in for who knows how long. Staying on the path gives you the prospect of something new. And you do practice with desire. We often hear that craving is the cause of suffering. That's true. But the Buddha points out three cravings in particular: craving for sensuality, for becoming, and for non-becoming. That's in the second noble truth. Yet in the fourth noble truth, he points out that the desire to develop what's skillful and abandon what's unskillful is part of the path to the end of suffering. So not all desire is bad. You want to get to know your desires really well and be able to sort them out. This is a useful skill to develop not only while you're here meditating, but also as you go through life and as you approach death, because the process of desiring is what will take you on to another life. You want to make sure you choose your desires well. There was a wanderer who came to see the Buddha one time and asked him, "What is it that sustains a being from one life to the next?" And the Buddha said it's sustained by clinging to craving, in the same way that wind sustains fire as it goes from one house to the next. The thing is, that's not the only time when you're sustained by your desires, sustained by your craving. As you go through your life, day by day, this is what defines you as a being. Notice that when the wanderer asked that question of the Buddha gave him a straight answer. Beings are sustained by craving. If the wanderer had asked some modern Buddhists, they might have said, well, there really is no being there anyhow. There's no continued identity, so there's nothing to go from one life to the next, which leaves people really adrift when they die. and they find that they're not ending. We sometimes think that the Buddha simply picked up his teachings on rebirth from his culture. But the way he taught rebirth was very different from what other people taught at the time. For one thing, not everybody in his culture believed in rebirth. Some said there was no rebirth, others said there was, and the way they would try to settle the issue would be by trying to define what you are. What is this thing, this being, and can this thing be reborn or not? Now, the Buddha took it as one of the basic principles of mundane right view that there is the next world. In other words, there is life after death. But he didn't get involved in the common terms of the discussion. He didn't say what it is that goes on. He said simply, this is how it happens. And how it happens is the same process that defines you as a being. Your craving, your attachments. The only people who are not beings are arahants because they have no attachments. That's why they don't get reborn. We create our identity as beings, then we sustain it with our craving. And then, when we find we can't stay here in this body, we grab at whatever. If you're not prepared, you will grab at whatever. The mind is capable of all kinds of things. As the Buddha said, it's more variegated than the animal kingdom. All the different animals that you can think of in the earth, on land, at sea, and in the sky, come from the craving of the mind. Look at the animal world and what you see is a small fraction of the many shapes and forms that the mind can take. When you're counseling someone who's facing death, that's what you want to keep in mind. That the mind is capable of grabbing on, holding on to anything. So make sure that the person holds on to good things. The Buddha's first advice is to ask if they're worried about anything. Usually it's with the family or with unfinished business. The Buddha's advice is to tell the person, just put that aside. You're dying now. There's nothing you can do for the family. There's nothing you can do about your unfinished business. The nature of the world is that all its business is unfinished. Tell the person who's passing away not to expect closure and focus instead on the state of his or her mind. The next question is, are you afraid of leaving your body? Are you afraid of leaving human sensuality? If the person says, yes, the Buddha's first answer is really interesting. He says that there are levels of being where the sensuality is better. Aim your mind there. Now, this will depend on what that person's belief systems are. When people are dying, you don't want to impose something new on them, as long as they do believe that the mind will survive death. What's important is that where the mind is holding on will create a state of mind that will either be lifted up or pulled down. So have the person think of things that will lift him or her up. In other words, the goodness they've done, not the good times they've had. If you get them thinking about the good times they've had, they might get depressed over the fact that those good times are over. Have them think instead of the times they've been generous, they've been virtuous, when they've shown their goodwill to others. Have them focus their mind there. In other words, give the mind something good to hold on to. Then the Buddha goes on to say that if the person is capable, you might say, even the best thing you can hold on to would be a self-identity. And self-identities are going to change and end. It would be better if you could let go of the need for self-identity. In other words, stop defining yourself as a being. Let go, totally. But for a lot of people, that's not in the cards. So instead, you have them focus on the good they've done. That way, when different possibilities open up to them as they find that they can't stay in the body, they'll have the confidence that they have some good to them. There's no reason why they have to go down. The Ajahns in Thailand talk about two kinds of visions that appear to a person passing away. The first kind consists of visions of their past actions. The other is visions of where they can go. If you've been focusing on some past bad actions, then if a vision of a bad place to go comes up, you're likely to fall for it, because that's one of the things we fear as we approach death. That maybe there will be some punishment lying in wait for the bad things we've done in life. This is one of the reasons why people who have done bad things often like to comfort themselves with the idea that, well, maybe if everything was predetermined, they didn't have any choice, they're not responsible, and therefore they won't get punished. But that's not how things work. The important thing to keep in mind is that there are only a very few things that would absolutely ensure that you would have to go down. Killing your parents, killing an arahant. As long as you haven't done any of those things, then you've got the possibility of going up. As the Buddha said, that's part of the complexity of karma. There are some times when you do something bad in this lifetime, but you don't suffer in the next, and vice versa. You do good things in this lifetime and yet you suffer in the next, because the karma you're dealing with is not just the karma in this lifetime, but also your karma from the past. Where you go also has to do with whether you change your mind, up or down, in the course of your life. This is why so much emphasis is placed on the state of the mind as you're dying. That's asking for an awful lot, because as you're dying, you're dealing with the fact that the body is not cooperating anymore. It's no longer doing the things it used to do for you. This is another reason why we meditate. To develop the strength of mind that doesn't have to depend on the strength of the functioning of the body. So work on your mind here, because it does influence how you're living, who you are in this lifetime, and how you go as you go to the next. And it is possible to change the mind. Past karma is not ironclad. It creates tendencies. But we can develop skills in the present moment to handle even bad tendencies and not suffer from them. This principle of having choice in the present moment is really central to the practice. You do have the choice to develop the mind or to do something else. The Buddha took this so seriously that even though he wasn't the sort of person who went around picking fights, he would go and search out teachers whom he had heard were teaching that you don't have choices, or if you do have choices, it doesn't matter because your actions don't have any results. Those kinds of teachings, the Buddha said, are really detrimental. The people who teach them do a lot of harm, which is why he felt it was important to seek those people out and see if he could change their minds, or at least let other people know that that kind of teaching was dangerous. As he said, it leaves you unprotected and bewildered. You don't want to be unprotected and bewildered as you're going through life, and especially as you're facing death. Have confidence that you can change the mind. You have that choice. And the mind does have possibilities, many of which are more than you can imagine. So, train the mind in the direction where it will go for the best possibilities. Keep in mind the principle of choice and have the confidence that, yes, you can learn how to make better and better choices. If that weren't possible, the Buddha wouldn't have taught. The fact that he did teach after gaining awakening is a sign that he wanted us to take this as a working hypothesis. That we do have choices. Because it's not until you gain your first taste of awakening that you really know for sure that, yes, you have choices, and that they can become so skillful that they can lead you to the end of suffering. Only at stream entry will you know for sure. Up to that point, it's a matter of faith, or if you don't like the word faith, use the word conviction. It's a working hypothesis. Act on it and, the Buddha says, you'll benefit. Everybody who's reached awakening also says you'll benefit. They're the kind of people you want to believe. The desire to be free from desire. October 4, 2019. There's a passage in the canon where a young monk is being asked by a king why he ordained. After all, the young monk came from a wealthy family, his health was good, his relatives were all alive. Why would he ordain? The monk replied that one of the reasons was that he saw all the world as a slave to craving, and he wanted to get out of that slavery. He gave an example to the king. Suppose someone were to come and say, there's a kingdom to the east with lots of wealth, lots of people, but a very weak army. Your army is strong enough to beat their army and seize that kingdom. Would you take it? And here the king is 80 years old, and yet he says, yes. Suppose another person would come from the south, the same message. Another person from the west, another from the north. Another person from across the ocean, saying there was a kingdom across the ocean that you could conquer. Lots of wealth, lots of people, would you go for it? The king says, yes. The young monk says, that's what I mean when I say the world is a slave to craving. There's another passage where the Buddha said that even if it rained gold coins, we wouldn't have enough to satisfy one person's sensual desires. The monk wanted to get out of that slavery to insatiable desires. Now, there are two ways of attempting that. One is just to deny desire, to tell yourself, I don't want anything. But that wasn't the Buddha's way. His way was to find a happiness so total that it satisfied all possible desires. Something outside of space and time, so that it couldn't be touched by changes in space and time. That would solve the problem of desire. But to get there requires desire. All phenomena, the Buddha said, are rooted in desire. This means all things good, all things bad, everything except nibbana is rooted in desire. Everything you experience is shaped by your desires. The mind is not a passive thing. It's active. It goes out looking for things. Looking for food, looking for clothing, shelter, looking for happiness. What we're doing as we practice is to take that tendency and direct it in a good direction. There's a passage where a Brahmin has come to see Ven Ananda, who was one of the Buddha's disciples, and asks, this path that you follow, what are its goals? Ananda says, one of the goals is to free the mind from desire. And then the Brahmin asks, how do you do that? Ananda says, one of the ways of doing it is to develop concentration based on desire and the development of right effort. And the Brahmin says, how can you use desire to get rid of desire? It would be an endless path. So Ananda gives him an analogy. He says, you came here to visit me in the park. Before you came here, did you have the desire to come here? Yes. And when you came here, what motivated you? Was it desire? Yes. Now that you're here at the park, where is the desire? The desire's been satisfied, so it's gone. That, Ananda said, is how you should understand this. To explain the path, the Buddha gives an image of a raft to take you across a river. Tie together twigs, leaves, and branches, and then paddle your way across. The paddling is your effort, and you have to hold on to the raft. But notice, that raft is made out of twigs, and leaves, and branches found on this side of the river. The Buddha didn't give the image of a nibbana yacht coming over and ferrying you across the river. You take things that you already have in your mind, you put them together in the right way, and they can help you get across. Then, when you get to the other side, you don't need them anymore. Now, among those twigs and leaves and branches is the desire that motivates right effort. You notice that some of your thoughts, some of the qualities of your mind, lead to happiness. You want to develop them. If they're not there, you want to give rise to them. If you've already got them, then you want to develop them even further. As for unskillful qualities based on greed, aversion, and delusion, you see that if you follow them, they take you in a direction you don't want to go. So if they're there, you want to abandon them. If they're not there, you want to prevent them from arising. So desire is an important part of the path. And this faculty of right effort, which includes skillful desire, underlies right mindfulness like we're practicing right now, trying to get the mind into concentration by being very mindful of the breath in and of itself. You have to want to focus on the breath and to put aside any thoughts that would pull you away. The Buddha recommends 3 qualities to help with this. One is mindfulness, the ability to keep something in mind. Then there's alertness, the ability to know what you're doing while you're doing it. And then ardency. Ardency is basically right effort again. Part of right effort, of course, is desire. These 3 qualities work together so that you remember when something comes up that would pull you away from the breath, you have to want to come back. You remember to come back, and you remember whatever techniques have worked. Sometimes when you've wandered away, all you have to do is notice the fact that you've wandered away and you come back. Other times, you have to remind yourself of the drawbacks of the thinking that would pull you away. At the very least, this is not the time for that kind of thinking. Or with heavier cases involving greed, aversion, or delusion, you want to see that any amount of time spent involved in that kind of thinking is going to be a waste. Or you may decide that you simply don't want to pay attention to that thinking. This is where perceiving the mind as a committee is useful. Some committee members may have their opinions, but you don't have to listen to everybody on the committee. You don't have to identify with everyone on the committee. If they're going to chatter about what they want, that's their business. You're going to stay focused on the breath. The thinking of the mind doesn't destroy the breath. It's still here. All you have to do is remember to stay focused here. You begin to notice, when you're really sensitive to the breath energy in the body, that when a thought comes into the mind, there will be a little pattern of tension associated with that thought someplace in the body. It might be in the arms, in the feet, in the forehead, around the eyes. It can be anywhere. If you sense that as soon as a thought comes in, there's a pattern of tension someplace in the body, you relax it. Breathe right through it. The thought will go away. If it comes back, just make up your mind that you're not going to let that thought come into the mind. This is where having a meditation word is useful, such as Buddha, which means awake. Just repeat that word again and again, rapid fire. It's like jamming the signals. This, of all the methods for keeping the mind from wandering off, requires the most desire, the strongest determination, and the least discernment. But if you think of these different methods as tools in your toolbox, this is the sledgehammer. Sometimes you need a sledgehammer when the finer tools are no match for the job. The important point is that you're ardent in doing this. You give it your whole heart. You realize that instead of being a slave to your desires, you want to take some control. You want your discernment, your wisdom, to be in charge of what you want, because what you want is going to shape everything you experience. If you direct your wants in the right direction, they can take you to a place where the wants are satisfied. When the Buddha talks about nibbana, he describes it as the highest happiness, peace, freedom, a consciousness without any limitations at all. Something that's true and unchanging. Something totally free from hunger, free from lack. So, the Buddha's not trying to have you deny desire. He's basically saying that it is possible to put your desires in order, straighten them out, tie them together, and make them into a raft that takes you over the flood of desire to the far shore. Once you get there, then you can put the raft aside. But while you're crossing over the river, don't let go. Try to identify which desires in your mind are the most trustworthy ones, the ones that open the most possibility for a genuine happiness. Don't let other desires push them aside. Make sure they're front and center, and this way you give the Buddha's teachings a chance. As he said, he can't show nibbana to anybody. All he can do is describe it as a possibility, as a desirable possibility, and he points out the path leading to that possibility. Then he leaves it up to each of us to prove whether or not he's right. So cultivate the desire to find out if he's right. Through your meditation, through your practice of virtue, concentration, and discernment, try to make yourself worthy of judging to see if what the Buddha said is really true. That kind of desire can be used to put an end to desire, to free you from this slavery to craving that otherwise drives the world and keeps us under its thumb. Training your desires. March 7, 2019. All phenomena are rooted in desire. Everything we experience, the Buddha said. And we desire happiness. So the question is, why don't we get the happiness we desire? Because our desires are ignorant. We're ignorant of the way things work. We want to put in only a little effort, or no effort at all, and get a happiness that lasts. We've learned, of course, at least to some extent, that that doesn't always work. There's a large part of the mind that really doesn't like that. It's when we realize that we have to change our understanding of what works and doesn't work, and that we have to train our desires. That's when wisdom begins. We realize that we can't get everything we want the way we want it. We have to learn to choose what we really want more than anything else and focus on that. As the Buddha says, if you see that a greater happiness comes from letting go of a lesser happiness, and if you're wise, you're willing to let go of the lesser happiness for the sake of the greater. There was an English scholar who translated that verse one time, and in a footnote he said that this couldn't possibly be what the verse means. It was just too simple, too obvious. Well, it may be obvious, but it's really not the way people live. We want to win at chess and keep all our pieces. We want our major desires and we want our little desires. We don't want to have to give anything up that we want. It's when we realize we do have to give certain things up, and we have to prioritize, that we begin to bring some knowledge to our desires. The Buddha said it's a several-step process. First, you realize that you need some training from other people who are more experienced than you are in terms of what brings true happiness. And you have to look for the right people. When you find someone who seems reliable, you have to watch that person for a good while. Ask yourself if there's anything in this person that would make this person want to claim knowledge of things he or she didn't know. Would this person ever get anyone else to do something that was not in that other person's best interest? It takes a while to observe a person to be able to judge this. But if you're truly serious about trying to find true happiness, you have to be responsible about who you choose to hang out with, who you choose to listen to, and who you choose as your friends. There have been so many cases of people finding out that their teachers are unreliable. But when you ask them what led up to the revelation, it turns out that there had been warning signs they chose to ignore. So, there's a certain responsibility placed on the student to try to find a good teacher. Then you spend time with the teacher. When you have a sense that the teacher is trustworthy, you listen to what the teacher has to say. You think it over. When it makes sense, that's when the Buddha says you begin to have a desire to do the practice. The example of the teacher has shown you that it is possible to find true happiness, a higher happiness than what you already have. That gives you some impetus to want to make some changes in your behavior. Then you listen to the teachings, and if they make sense, that gives you even more impetus. A really good teaching opens up your perspective on what true happiness is, so that you're willing to let go of lesser things. That's how the desire to practice begins. And that's why the Buddha defined ignorance as ignorance of the Four Noble Truths, not ignorance of the three characteristics, ignorance of the Four Noble Truths, because they revolve around desire. There's the unskillful desire that causes suffering. Then there's the skillful desire in the Noble Eightfold Path, under the factor of right effort, that leads to the end of suffering. The skillful desire wants to develop all skillful qualities in the mind and abandon all unskillful qualities. That's the kind of desire you want to encourage. But the Four Noble Truths also set out the possibility of finding an ultimate happiness that's unchanging and true total freedom. That is a human possibility, and the Four Noble Truths set it out clearly. They don't say, for instance, that you simply have to accept the fact that there's going to be change in life, so just accept the change, or that things are impermanent and stressful, so accept the impermanence and stress, or that things are not self, so accept that they're not self and content yourself with that. That's not what they say. The Four Noble Truths say that ultimate happiness is possible and can be gained through human effort. And the proper way to respond to that is to see it as a challenge. Here's a possibility as to what you can do. Do you want to accept that challenge? If so, look at the other things you've been doing in life that would get in the way. Can you learn how to say no to them? As the Buddha said, a measure of your wisdom is when there are things you like to do, but you know are going to lead to suffering or harm, and you can say no to them. Things you may not like to do, but you know are going to lead to long-term welfare and happiness. Teach yourself how to want to do those things. In this way, you're training your desires in the direction of a happiness that's really reliable. And it is possible. It can be done. There are people who have found it, good people, reliable people. Now, you can't see their happiness. Ajahn Mahabua said that if you could take Nibbana out and show it to everybody, that's the only thing anybody would ever want. Everything else in the world would pale by comparison. But you can't see someone else's experience of it. Still, you look at the people who seem to have found it, and they seem to be good people. That's the beginning of conviction. It's not knowledge, but it's conviction, the conviction that gives force to your desire to want to practice more. Otherwise, it might seem that nobody in the world is really awakened, or the best anybody can do is just accept things as they are, and not try to make any changes. But then what kind of effort would you want to put out? It would be very discouraging. There'd be no reason to make any effort at all, no desire to make any effort at all, and you'd be stuck where you are in a situation that's really not acceptable. When the Buddha talks about accepting things, it's not about accepting where you are and staying there. It's about accepting the fact that you're responsible for shaping your life, and that things could be better if you trained yourself to shape your experience in a better way. That way, if you're going to look for the cause of suffering, you have to look inside. That's another message from the Four Noble Truths. Again, it's a message that we may not like to hear. We like to blame our suffering on other people. But think about it. If your suffering comes from other people, what are you going to do? Are you going to change them? And how many people in the world would you have to change? There'd be no end to it. But as the Buddha points out, suffering comes from our ignorant craving, and that's something we can do something about. Ignorance may have been long-lasting, as the Buddha said. You can't trace back in time to find a point where ignorance began, but it doesn't have any right to lay claim to you. Ajahn Suwat's images of taking a light into a place that's been dark for who knows how long. The darkness can't say, "We've been here ever since time began, so this light has no right to chase us away." As soon as there's light, the darkness has to go. As soon as there's knowledge, your ignorance goes. Regardless of how ignorant you've been in the past, it's something you can change. The Four Noble Truths set a high standard, but they also promise a lot. They provide a path we can follow, and it leads to true happiness, ultimate, unchanging, unlimited happiness. When you think about that, then whatever is required on the path doesn't seem so onerous. It doesn't seem so scary. It doesn't seem so large. The happiness we want is much larger than what we have. We have to keep that in mind at all times. So, when you find yourself getting lazy, ask yourself if this is the best you can do. Is this how you show your desire for true happiness, by making excuses for your laziness? Try to encourage the diligent internal chatter that the Buddha talked about when he cited the reasons for laziness and the reasons for being diligent. The outside situations are always the same. You may say, "I've been traveling a lot," or "I've been sick," or "I didn't get much to eat this morning," and make that an excuse for not practicing. But you can also say, "I was traveling a lot. I didn't have a chance while I was traveling to practice, but now I have the chance. I've been sick. I didn't have the chance when I was sick, but now I have the chance to practice. When I don't eat much, the body's light. It's not weighed down by all that food. It's a good time to practice." How you talk to yourself is what's going to make all the difference. That's where you see wisdom in action. So try to get some wise voices in on your internal conversation. Inform them with the Four Noble Truths, and teach them to train your desires so that they really do lead to the happiness you want, or, as the Buddha says, a better happiness than your desires can imagine. At the very least, encourage the desires that try to imagine that kind of happiness. Then make sure those desires actually do take control of your actions, so that, in accepting what really does lead to happiness, you can do what's needed to get there. In alignment with the teachings of the Buddha, we emphasize the profound importance of sharing wisdom far and wide. We've made this extensive 1,000-page work accessible in audio format, and the responsibility to further this noble cause now rests with you. Through your subscriptions, likes, and the sharing of our content, you play a central role in the widespread dissemination of these teachings, which can benefit numerous others. Let's continue the timeless tradition of spreading knowledge and nurturing mindfulness for the betterment of humanity. We wholeheartedly invite you to join us in this endeavor, and together, we can make a profound and positive impact on the lives of many.